Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another exciting installment of the Watcher's story, or the Watcher's myth, or the Watcher's narrative, and how it develops in Second Temple texts. So I want to kind of sum up where we're at, right? So we've had a week gap. So we looked at Watchers, that story in the Book of Enoch. And we saw how that was already that the Book of Enoch that we have was already combining different accounts of what these angels did, what their sin was, what the consequences were. In other words, did they reveal forbidden knowledge that then caused humans to sin? Did they have intercourse with human women? And the giants then caused violence. And then we looked at how that was taken in Jubilees, where Jubilees is taking the Enochic account and developing it. And one of the things that we saw in Jubilees was that it adds something unique to the story, which is that after the giants are killed and they have these demonic spirits are placed under mastema. We talked a little bit about why someone would want to do that. Why would someone want to do that? Because there's already a belief. And let's take a step back for a second and say, why does anyone want to believe in these demonic forces? And the answer is because you want to believe that something that's not God, if you believe in an omnipotent and omniscient God, right, then you have to explain evil. You have to explain evil things happening to people, and you have to explain why people want to do evil things. And in a certain sense, the easiest thing to do is to find some kind of force that's not God that you can point to, and you can say, oh, this is what's causing all the bad, right? The problem is that then you're like, wait a second, but isn't God omnipotent and omniscient, and God can do anything? So why is God allowing this? And so we have in the Book of Jubilees an attempt to take this idea of these demonic spirits causing sin, causing misfortune, and having this member of the heavenly court, Mastema, who's like the Satan type character, saying, hey, I need these guys to help do my job. And God's like, okay, you know what? You can keep 1/10 of them and they can do work for you. And that is all part of the divine system. And I said that this is not unique in Jewish thought. We have it much earlier in ancient Near Eastern thought, according to Van der Toorn, who looks at the ancient Babylonian epics and proposes that that's the reason that you have the Peshitu demon being brought up in the flood narrative, that after the flood, because that's the gods trying to curb human population, they're like, we can't do that again. How are we going to curb the human population? We have a Peshitu demon that will kill babies and cause miscarriages and all these horrible things that in fact curb the human population. And what he proposes is that everyone already believed in Peshitu demon, and in fact, we find incantations against this demon to, of course, protect, and amulets to protect babies, etc. But the author of the Enuma Elish wanted to put them into a divine system, wanted to say the Peshitu demon, wanted to say this Peshitu demon is not just a chaotic demon. This Peshitu demon has a purpose under the gods, right? And that way there's kind of an order, and the divine order means something. Here we've seen this kind of struggle that on the one hand, you don't want to say that evil is God's fault. On the other hand, how can you say anything is not God's fault? So you have to kind of bring them back into the divine system. Okay. So now what we're going to see is how the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we're going to look at specifically sectarian documents, that is, documents that were actually composed by members of the Qumran community, how they kind of took this belief, and we'll see that in cases of prayer and incantations, they in fact do not mention Mastema as as a controlling force. They're going back to this idea of these demons being just evil and chaotic and something that God can help you against, right? But not under a divine system. Because again, it's very hard to say that these horrible things are happening because of a divine system, or that you have these horrible desires, which you shouldn't have because of a divine system. So they kind of go back to this idea. We're going to talk about that in just a bit. Now, I was asked earlier by someone by a member of the class, in terms of who is writing and reading these books, how is this happening? And the answer is, of course, we don't know. With Qumran scrolls, it's easier because we have a kind of a context for the scrolls. So let me explain what I mean. We have the Book of Enoch. I've said it more than once that the Book of Enoch is actually a bunch of books that are all connected by the figure of Enoch. They were all kind of collected in a single work. When did that exactly happen? We don't know, right? We do know that the Dead Sea Scrolls have fragments of most of those works, but we don't know what led to anyone to say, okay, this is all one book. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know who was copying it. We don't know why only the Ethiopian church kept it. We don't know any of these things, right? The Ethiopian church was keeping it when it was already translated into Greek, right? And then they translated into Ethiopic. So we can just guess, right? In terms of there being this kind of lay communities, and we do read about in the Talmud, the Mishnah, we read about these smaller communities of people who say, we're going to be extra pure, we're going to keep purity laws very carefully, we're going to live together, we're going to have, and one assumes that they may be more particularly learned, they're reading, they're copying, they're writing. And then you have, and with the Qumran community, it's much easier to see because we have this community that's talking about themselves, identifying themselves, saying this is why we separated out from the temple service, because they weren't religious enough for us, essentially. They weren't exclusive enough. They weren't careful enough about purity. And look, we have the right calendar, we have the right law. And now you have a bunch of people that they are reading, and learning is very important to them. They are copying and they are writing. And so we can assume that there were various communities like this throughout the land of Israel, of people who were not so busy with farming or anything else that they had time to study and to read and to write. Now, just so you know, that they say that in terms of Qumran, what they describe as a ration, because you remember that the Qumran scrolls describe a community that's living communally and sharing in rations. The rations are fairly large. They seem to have been doing pretty well for themselves. So it was absolutely possible to have a life where you're living possibly from growing dates. That's one of the theories, and creating whatever and also probably producing like Ceylon, date syrup, things like that. And you could still have time to do other things. So it's absolutely possible that you'd have people who are working and also felt that it was very important to read and to study and to write and to copy, but one assumes that those people were members of communities. In terms of who was reading these books, in Enoch, we're talking about a wider community than Qumran. Jubilees, we're talking about a wider community than Qumran. These works do not have specifically sectarian language. They don't have specifically sectarian ideas. Their ideas are much broader. In certain ways, they don't quite match with Qumran, and their concerns are different. So we can tell that this is written by a broader community, but what's still important to the members of the Qumran community. Now we're going to dive into things that the Qumran community themselves wrote, right? And they have very specific ideas about how these things work. Now, I see that there was a question here from Susan. Why did the intellectual struggle over the problem of evil happening when God is supposed to be good and omniscient start at the time of Enoch, Jubilees, and not earlier? So that's an excellent question. And of course, it didn't just start in the Second Temple period. We have the problem of evil bad things happening to good people And as I've mentioned, good things happening to bad people much earlier, right? We certainly had it in the First Temple period. However, this is the first time when people are really concerned about the source of sin. Why do I want to sin? This is not even an issue in earlier texts. What we continually think of as the reason for the Adam and Eve story, that this somehow explains sin, it does not explain sin. Go back to the Adam and Eve story, reread it, you will see that it does nothing to explain sin. It never says, and this is where sin came from, it never explains why they had the gumption to not listen to God, right? I mean, the snake had something to do with it, obviously, but this idea that sin was something that had to be explained, as I've mentioned, the closest explanation to sin is the one that Cain gets, right? When he is angry at Hevel, and that explanation does not seem to do him much good because he goes ahead and performs the first murder. However, that is the closest that we get to a real explanation of sin, and it doesn't seem to have much of an effect beyond that. Now, there actually are certain texts, particularly Josephus connects Cain and the flood. It's not surprising that there are those pseudo Philo perhaps connects Cain and the flood. However, the idea that all sin came from Cain is not something that you see. And in this period, in the Second Temple period, again, Cain, the story of Cain is just not usually used as an explanation for sin. And I think it's because Cain is a sinner. And so what we want to know, we, the community, we, the readers of these texts, we, the writers of these texts, we want to know what righteous people have to deal with when we have. So, like, notice, I am righteous, I had sinful thoughts, I want to sin. Why is that? Where's that coming from? I don't care why a sinner wants to sin. He's evil. Okay. So that is one of the things that people are trying to deal with in this period, specifically why do I want to sin? So Danny and Libby asked, so where did the Christian idea of original sin come from? I said this before, I'll say it again. This idea did exist in the Second Temple period. We see a hint to it in Ben Sira. Ben Sira says all sin is from a woman, and that seems to be like a little bit of a hint to that story existing, right? But when Ben Sira explains evil, he does not explain through Adam at all, through Adam's sin at all, when he's actually explaining sin and evil. But the fact that he can hint to it sounds like there is that story going around. Paul, of course, is a Jew living during the Second Temple period, and he sure knows the story, right? That sin comes from Adam. And we have two books written right after the destruction of the Second Temple, namely 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, that both take the story of sin coming from Adam as a given, right? Where both of them are working with this idea, where 4th Ezra kind of accepts it as true and 2nd Baruch argues with it. But the fact is they both see this as a major explanation. So it's there, it's just under the surface. The question is, why does it rise to the surface after the destruction? The theory that I have, and anyone can feel free to shoot it down because it's real speculation, is that the destruction of the Second Temple was considered so cataclysmic, it has to respond to a cataclysmic sinfulness. And so it was easier to say, well, the sinfulness is brought down, this cataclysmic sinfulness comes from something primordial, something early, something that Adam himself did, right? Either and in 4th Ezra, you can read it two different ways. Either that Adam's sin caused the evil heart, or that Adam himself had an evil heart and it was passed down. So either one. The author of 4th Ezra doesn't seem to care which one, because he seems to indicate those two different versions in different places. Okay, so coming back to our texts. So now we're going to see, in terms of the actual lived experience of people at Qumran, how they were struggling with this desire to sin. Now, again, there's this idea, not just in Second Temple literature, but there's this idea that I am righteous because I'm righteous, right? I may sin sometimes, I'm still righteous, right? But then the question is, well, why do I sin? What do I need to do after I sin? But that doesn't stop me from being one of the righteous, right? So people here are speaking as one of the righteous, one of the assumed righteous. Oh, I see that there's another question here. So Moshe Matitya is saying, are you saying that the Garden of Eden story is not about sin? Because his message seems to be that man is intrinsically sinful and therefore unworthy of an intimate relationship with God. I would say not. I would say that that's the message of the generation of the flood. I would say that the idea that man is intrinsically sinful is explicitly stated around the flood, and it is not at all stated around the Garden of Eden story, while the Garden of Eden story does show that a specific sin gets him thrown out of the garden, and that specific sin seems to be that now he has knowledge. He has knowledge that separates, that no longer allows him to be in the Garden of Eden, because he got knowledge that now is going to separate him. It tells him that he's naked, right? He's not, again, I keep coming back to this because I really do think that a lot of it has to do with not being like animals, right? That he now has knowledge that separates him from animals forever, and he cannot have this peaceful Edenic existence. But feel free to argue with me, just not right now, okay? So let's move into our text.
Miriam?
Yes.
You said that you don't think that the biblical story actually claims that original sin started with Adam and Eve, right?
I think that the biblical story isn't concerned with original sin. I think that the biblical story isn't trying to explain where sin comes from, because no one cares. That's what I think.
So what does the story show? Like, what happened when they know?
What happens? What happens? I get, okay, I'm gonna have to do this. Okay, what happens in the story? What actually happens? Okay, the snake says, "You eat this, and you're and you'll be like a god," right? And then they eat it, and then they know that they're naked, right? He said, God says, why did you hide? Because we're naked, we're ashamed. He's like, how did you know you're naked? You ate from the tree of knowledge, okay? And then they say they better not allow them to eat from the other tree, because then they'll live forever, okay? They've got to get out now, all right? And then what are they cursed with? They're cursed with Adam's going to have to work for his food, okay? He's going to get it by the sweat of his brow. He is going to die. So you can absolutely say that death starts there, right? That is, you can absolutely read that in the verses, right? You don't have to, but it's pretty clear, right? Eve is going to bear children with pain, right? The snake is going to bite them. It's always going to be in enmity with these people, okay, with humans, all right? And it will be on the ground. Right, and the snake will always be on the ground, right? And of course they're thrown out of Eden, so of the Garden of Eden. And so what you have is you have a story where originally they were just eating fruit. Apparently, they were picking fruit off trees. That's what they ate. They don't have to work. They don't have to work at all. They have to keep the garden, right? There's no work involved. Now there's work. Now Adam's going to have to grow grain. Right? Unlike animals who don't grow anything, right? Adam's going to have to work and grow grain. Eve is going to not just be able to lie down in the fields and give birth like most animals, she is going to have trouble giving birth, okay? Now, she also gets the curse, of course, that her husband is essentially going to rule her. Her desire is to her husband, and therefore he will rule her, okay? Now, that is the closest parallel to sin, because then when Cain hears his statement about sin, God tells him, he says, sin, its desire is to you and you will rule over it. The same language that God uses to Eve regarding her husband, your desire is to him and he will rule over you. So you say, oh, look, there's a parallel here. You've got a parallel between Cain and sin and Adam and Eve, right? And if you read the words, they really are the same words, the same structure. It's a very interesting parallel. What's interesting conceptually is But the idea is that whoever is desired is the person who rules, right? You're desired, therefore you rule the other thing because they need you, right? Now that's another aspect. You could, if you're really pushing it, like you could also say that that separates humans from animals, where there are many animals where the female is quite clearly in charge. You don't want to be a male hyena. That is a miserable life, right? There are lots of species where the female is in charge. And at least for millennia with humans, that was absolutely not true, right? And the more the more what you would call like the more primitive society, the more you're going to see a situation where women really are not in charge. So if
you skipped like the main part. What about no good from evil? Like this is also part of
right.
This is the biggest thing.
So like Kasuto says, if you look at what does know good, so first of all, knowing good from evil, fine. What does that have to do with sin? You can know good, they now know good from evil. You would think now they even know better not to sin. They ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now they should know not to sin. That shouldn't be the source of sin.
Now they can sin.
No. That is, it's what I learned in grade school too, right? But we're reading into it there, right? Because that's not what it's the knowledge of good and evil. The knowledge of good and evil should be actually to know what's good. Now, it's interesting, Kasuto says, and I like Kasuto's explanation, he's like, if we look at how that phrase is used, knowledge of good and evil, it just seems to me knowing anything, right? When it's talking about, I think it's in Cheta Miraglim, the sin of the spies, and it's talking about their children, and it's like, your children are the ones who are going to enter the land of Israel. It says, your children who don't know good and evil, right? And what they mean is who don't know anything yet. They're little babies. They know nothing, right? And so Kasuto is like, if we look at other places where this phrase is used, it's meant to mean if you don't know that Tovara, if you don't know good and evil, it means you don't know anything yet. You're like a little baby, right? And that is possibly what it means here. They don't know anything. They are like animals. They're like human animals, right? They don't know anything. And now they're going to know something. They're gonna have knowledge again. How did you know you were naked? What does that have to do with good and evil? It does have to do with sexual morality, right? So it's, and again, they're in the idea that now they want to be clothed doesn't seem to indicate that now they want to sin. Now they want to be clothed because they see that there's something to do with nakedness that they're not, that needs to be covered. Right.
So now they know that to be like uncovered is not okay, because you're doing something sexual, and now they can sin with sexual issues.
But they don't, do they? Right. In fact, you would think that a sin would be like, the fact is before the sin, before the sin, God takes Adam around to all the animals, and Adam doesn't find a mate, right? Because the animals aren't going to do it for him. Now, you would think that would be a sin, right? That doesn't happen, right? Adam and Eve are pretty faithful to each other. I mean, you say, well, who else could he do? Well, they're animals, right? God offered him, and Adam's like, no. I need something else, right? And the fact is that Adam and Eve stay together. There's no even hint in the biblical story of the biblical narrative of any sort of sexual anything, right? So you don't have an indication of this is where sin comes from. You could say this is the first sin just by definition because they're disobeying God.
Miriam?
But it doesn't have sinful implications. Okay, very short, because guys, let's go to the actual topic
very
of the
short.
class. Yes.
I mean, don't you think that the Garden of Eden story has at its center the prototypical story of you had one job and you couldn't do it, and by saying that's saying that's the way people are intrinsically. They sin. That's the way it is. There's nothing you could do about it, and
I'll tell you, it's more that he's doing the job because he's keeping the garden, but it's more like they said, don't press the red button, and someone's going to press the red button.
Yeah.
Or you're done with the sentence, someone's pressing the red button.
Yes,
right?
and the next day you're going to sin in something else.
But
Therefore,
the explanation of that sin, honestly, the explanation of the sin is so roundabout. Like if you were going to say people are going to intrinsically sin, then you wouldn't have to have the snake. Why is the snake busy telling Eve? And the snake seems to be right. What the snake seems to say seems to bear out from what happens afterwards. And then he first convinces Eve, and then she gives it to Adam. I mean, I do think it's kind of funny the way Adam blames her, like, right, there's a wonderful painting which is just like Adam going, like, pointing to Eve, going, I don't know, to me.
Oh yeah, that's it. Not only is man sinful, but he's pathetic. He won't take responsibility.
And you can absolutely learn that from it, but that's not what the story's about. And whereas you have the flood story, which is about that, which is explicitly about that. In other words, I think it's about, see, the fact, and I am a big fan of biblical narrative, and I think it can be about more than one thing. I think you have, and also I think the biblical narrative is complex and leaves a lot of gaps for us to fill in as well, right? And because of that, you can absolutely say, hey, that's what this is reflecting. And I can say, yes, but the point of the story is this is why people are not like animals, and this is why people can't live in some kind of fruity paradise, right? And you could say, and why they die, right? That could absolutely, because those are explicit. And then the thing about people being sinful, God acts like he doesn't know that people are sinful until the flood happened, until before the flood. God's like, hey, these guys are just sinful all day.
It went to a whole new level.
Boy, these guys are sinful all day. I can't do the flood again. They're still sinful.
Yeah, that's it. They're sinful all day. That's all they do is sin. That's much worse. That's Adam sinned just once in the day.
I'm fine with this for interpretation, Moshe. I just don't think that is the purpose of the stories, right? Going back, okay. We can always do I've done numerous classes on this. I can always do another one. I'm always up for it, in case you haven't noticed. Let's go to our scrolls. All right, I'm putting this up on the screen. Excuse me. Let's see. All right. Okay, so this is just the Book of Jubilees in case we wanted the refresher, but let's just jump into the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we're not going to do rabbinic, we're not getting to rabbinic literature, obviously, and frankly, we're just going to be able to touch right now. We'll continue with this next week. Here we have the Watchers in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and let's talk about what these are. The Songs of the Sage are they're kind of a prayer, an incantation that's put in the mouth of the maskil, who's a kind of a leader. That's the sage of the title. He's kind of a leader of the community. All right. And here, and as with many of these, especially when we have something from cave 4, 4 is the cave number, Q is for Qumran. So if this was from Masada, we'd have an M there, for example. And 511 being the number of the scroll. 48 to 49 and the 51 are the numbers of the fragments. Okay, to double I column, and then these are the lines. Okay. So Binato Natan Bilvavi, his knowledge he put in my heart. He's talking about God, obviously. The praises of his righteousness, and by his mouth, ubifi, yivchad kol ruchot mamzerim. He frightens all the spirits of the bastards. As I've mentioned before, whenever we see bastards in these contexts, it means the product of the illicit union between angels and women. Remember that mamzerim, bastards, are always in Jewish law the product of an illicit union. They're not children born out of wedlock. Children born out of wedlock are not a problem. Mamzerim are a problem. They're produced from an illicit union. So God is going to frighten all the spirits of the bastards, to subdue lachnia tum'ah, to subdue something uncleanness. Ki b'tachmei b'sari, because in the innards of my flesh, we have no idea what tachmei actually means. We only find it at Qumran, okay? But we're doing a contextual understanding of it. Ubigviati milchamot, and in my body are wars. Chukei el bilvavi, the laws of God are in my heart. Ve'oil al kol moftei gever, and I will profit from all of the wonders of man. What's going on here? What's going on here is that he's got the spirits of the bastards. There are battles inside him because he has the laws of God in his heart, and yet these spirits of the bastards are fighting inside him. Okay, and so he needs to call on God, who God will frighten these spirits away. Note how these spirits are not a clear, understandable part of, they're not like a punishment that I have coming to me. They're not a part of a divine order. I'm calling on God to frighten these horrible spirits away. Okay. Here we have these same spirits being included in a list of harmful spirits and forces. Vani maskil, this is also in Songs of the Sage. Vani maskil, and I maskil. Mashmia ho tifarto lepached ulebahel. I am giving voice to the glory, his glorious splendor, to frighten and terrify. Kol ruche malache chavel or chaval veruchot mamzerim shedim lilit ochim v'tziim. Okay, so all of the spirits of destructive angels and the spirits of the bastards, demons, Lilith, Ochim and Si'im are taken from a verse in Yeshayahu, so is Lilith, by the way, are all taken from a verse in Yeshayahu, which is kind of talking about these random, dangerous things at night, right? V'hapogim peta pitom, who suddenly strike, litot ruach bina ula Hashem livavam, to cause a spirit of understanding to stray. Okay, so the idea is not that these are just like causing disease; these are causing sin. Okay, and it's here we have, right, biket memshelet risha, during the time of the ruling of wickedness. Now, this is a very important concept that we have at Qumran, and I've mentioned Belial is frequently connected to the figure of Belial, who's a satanic character, but is directly opposed to God. Memshelet Belial, which is not the phrase here. Memshelet Belial is the rule of Belial. It's the dominion of Belial, rather. It's the time period in which Belial rules, or evil rules. And this way, by talking about evil ruling, it's a way to say, this is a given time under God when evil rules, and therefore there are all these random, horrible spirits that are afflicting me and trying to make me sin. Okay, now it's particularly, if you think about how hard it was to be a member of the Qumran community, and probably how hard it was to be for any of these kind of intellectual communities that were trying to be stricter and more careful, they had to deal with this all the time. And these are prayers that are meant to say, what? Help me, right? They're asking for help. Now, I did a whole study of when are these things more deterministic and when do they emphasize free will? And I found that in prayers in general, they're going to be more deterministic. In prayers in general, they're going to say, I can't do it myself. God, I need your help. And that's understandable. There's an experience with prayer that Carol Newsom called the masochistic sublime, that you're making yourself very, very small. You're saying, I am nothing. Right? You, God, are everything. So here I am powerless, right? Here again, and here in the continuation of this, and v'ani mirei el, I practice the fear of God, or I am one of the fearers of God, right? In other words, I'm a righteous person, right? And I'm going to exalt God's name. And it says, and here this is a guess, lefached, to frighten, big vuato, kol ruchei mamzerim lachni'am yirato, right? To frighten with God's strength all the spirits of the bastards. Once again, we have this idea of for the period of their rule. They're only allowed this period to rule, but during this period, I need God's help to fight them. Okay. These are prayers where you're praying to God. Well, I shouldn't say that. These are prayers, but they're also kind of incantations because he's talking about using God's name against these spirits. In this next piece, 11Q Apocryphal Psalms, it's much more of an incantation. Okay, I'm just going to read the English. When he comes to you in the night, you will say to him, "Who are you, O offspring of man and of the seed of the holy ones?" Right? Hayalud me Adam ume zera hakdoshim. Your face is a face of delusion, and your horns or rays are horns, rays of illusion. You are darkness and not light, injustice and not justice. He is being visited in a visible way by one of these descendants, right? And he has to get it away from him. Okay. Yes.
Is the idea that they're inside of him or they're outside of him?
In this one, they seem to be outside.
And then
right?
the other ones?
In the previous ones, it seems pretty clearly that they're inside, right? That they're causing sin. In this one, you don't have to say that it has to do with sin necessarily, right? Even though it seems to be that he's tricking someone. He's like, your face is a face of delusion here. Panecha pnei shav, the karnecha karnei chalom, right? Your horns or rays are a dream or an illusion. So it seems like it's trying to get him to do something, possibly. It's trying to kind of, so because you have to say you're nothing, right? You're just an illusion. You're darkness and not light. Don't like mislead me, right? But it seems to be describing something that's outside of himself in this case. Okay. 4Q 444, it's called 4Q incantation, but S.T. has argued pretty convincingly that this is a prayer. And here again, here we have again this is a clearer description actually of it being in his body. And as for me, because of my fearing God, with his again, I'm Ani Mirei, right? I'm one of the God-fearers. I'm righteous, right? With his true knowledge, he opened my mouth, and from his Holy Spirit, we're missing truth to all these. They became spirits of controversy in my bodily structure, laws of God in innards of flesh. In other words, you've got, I'm looking at again, Liruche Riv b'mavniti, right? They're spirits, they're fighting spirits inside of me, in my frame, right? While the laws of God are in my flesh. Okay. And once again, he's saying, and a spirit, and God is, in this case, God has given him a spirit of knowledge and understanding, truth and righteousness. God put in my heart, right? Something, and strengthen yourself by the laws of God in order to fight against the spirits of wickedness. Who are these spirits of wickedness? Mamzerim v'ruach hatuma, right? They're the bastards and the spirit of impurity. Again, connection of these spirits descended from the watchers and the fight within me between the laws of God and the spirits that want me to sit.
Miriam?
So yes,
Is it safe to say here that the speaker here, it considers himself to be a representative of the Yachad, a representative member of the Yachad?
I would say in the Songs of the Sage, yes. Here, no. So if you look at the Songs of the Sage, sure, he's a representative of the Yachad. In this, it's just a prayer. It's a prayer that's written down for people to say, right? So he's absolutely a member of the community. I'll actually take a second now actually to explain. When I say these texts are sectarian, I mean that they're written by the community, they're composed by the community. There are plenty of texts that are in the Dead Sea Scrolls that were not composed by the community, but were read by the community. So for example, the Genesis Apocryphon, which we looked at earlier, which was this Aramaic retelling of, the Avram story, some of the Noah story, etc. That book is almost certainly from outside the sect and was simply read by the sect. These works are considered to be sectarian, composed by the sect. And the reason is because it's using language of the sect. Obviously with a maskil, he's a specific officer of the sect, right? But in general, in all of these, they will use phrases like tachmei basar, right? Which is specific to the Qumran community, or the idea of the dominion of evil, right? In this period, and other similar phrases that are specific to the community, and that's why. And once you read a bunch of sectarian texts, you get very used to like, oh, okay, that's the world I'm in now. I'm in a world where they know the right way, they're righteous, God has lifted them, God has given them some special knowledge, a special spirit, a special holiness that allows them to not sin, and yet they're struggling with sin.
Can you make a blanket statement that all the psharim, all the apocrypha are from the outside and are non-sectarian?
No, the psharim are generally considered to be sectarian. All the psharim are generally considered to be sectarian. All of them, as far as I know. Now, as far as I know, the Pesher is considered to be specifically to the community. We've only found that form in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the major examples specifically talk about the community of those psharim. Now, there are psharim that are maybe a little bit more general, but in general, the psharim are considered to be sectarian. Okay. Now, I wanted to show also another. We still have a few minutes. I want to show another aspect of this way of dealing with the Watcher story. So first of all, remember when I said about prayer that that prayer tends to be more deterministic. It's asking God for help, you could say. You know, asking God for help. It's not necessarily deterministic, but it's less agency. Let's say that. Let's put it that way. But with rule books do tend to emphasize agency because you're supposed to follow the rules. In the Damascus document, and I'm going to explain a little bit about the Damascus document in just a second. Okay, in the Damascus document, we see a different treatment of the Watcher story from what we saw in the prayers above. So the Damascus document. The Damascus document is very interesting because it's the very first example of a Qumran text that we had, because it was copied in the medieval period, and that is how we have it. We have it in two copies. That's how we have it in its complete form. We have it in two copies from medieval texts from the Geniza, and that's why it is. That's why it's more complete than others, and yet it's also problematic because we are reading a text that we have not found in full at Qumran, but we have absolutely found copies of it, fragmentary copies of it at Qumran. So in fact, we know for sure that this is a Qumran document. And usually when we read the medieval form because it's the most complete one. But we absolutely do have fragments that kind of map onto the Damascus document. The Damascus document is unlike Serach HaYachad, the rule of the community, in that it mentions wives and women. It goes into laws, wives and women, and at least laws of who you can marry, etc. It also so the question is what is the relationship between the Damascus document and the community rule? Certainly, early on, the theory was because people wanted to see the Qumran community as Essenes, and Josephus said that the Essenes in the cities could marry and have kids. They said, okay, so the Damascus document is for the Essenes in the cities. Now we don't necessarily see the Qumran community as Essenes, right? They were a group that has a lot in common with what we know about the Essenes, and they kept Saddukite law, it seems seemingly, and they don't have any specific law anywhere that says they don't marry. That's one thing that you don't have even in the community rule. The community rule only talks about men, but it doesn't say you can't marry. And as Eyal Regev showed, in general, when you have communities where you're not allowed to marry, that is a rule that is all over the rule books because it is a very hard rule to keep. And here it is nowhere in the rule books. And in the Damascus document, it does talk about, again, marriage. And in Serach HaEdah, which is a rule book written for the Messianic age, it also talks about marriage. So it's not clear that in this community, marriage was actually outlawed. Okay, so with that, let's go into the Damascus document. There's a lot interesting that we could say about the Damascus document. Beyond that, we will come back to it. But for now, let's take a look and see where the Watchers feature in this. Here's an introduction to this rule book, right? And it's giving you kind of a history of sin, okay? And now, O sons, hearken to me, and I will uncover your eyes, so you may see and understand the works of God, and choose that which he wants, and despise that which he hates, to walk perfectly in all his ways, and not to go about in the thoughts of an inclination of guilt and lecherous eyes. Okay, inclination of guilt and lecherous eyes are here. Okay, so here, what causes one to sin? Things that are basic to the human being. Your own heart and eyes cause you to sin. That's what causes you to sin. For many have strayed due to them. Mighty men of valor have stumbled due to them from their earliest times and until today. Walking after the stubbornness of their hearts, the watchers of heaven fell. They were held by it, for they did not keep God's commandments, and so too their sons, giants, who were as high as lofty cedars, and whose bodies were like mountains. For all flesh which was on dry land fell, for they died and were as if they had not been, for they had done their own will, and had not kept the commandments of their Maker until his wrath was kindled against them. How is the Watcher's story being retold here? It's very, very different from what we've seen so far, right? Here, we're going back to this idea that the Watchers are the first sinners. They're the first guys who really sinned, at least in this story. It's not that they don't know Adam, but he's not talking about Adam. He's like, to give you an idea of how even the mighty can fall through following their own eyes and hearts. The angels fell through following their own eyes and hearts. Wow. And then they had giants, and you know what? They were all killed in the flood. Because in the final analysis, God decides, right? They're all gone. Gone. All killed in the flood, right? Now it's your job to ignore the stubbornness of your heart, because you know, and if we're looking at the whole thing, we have several times the idea that you should not follow your own heart. Instead, you should follow God's laws. In other words, you have God's laws and your heart, which will automatically be opposed. Your own will be automatically opposed to God's laws. And that's what you have to know. And that's how you need to follow the law, right? You need to know. Don't listen to your heart. Don't listen to your eyes. Don't look with lecherous eyes, right? No. God's commandments, right? And who shows that you're never safe? Don't think you're so righteous. Don't think you're so mighty that you can follow your own will. The Watchers, those angels that fell. But there's no demons here. There are no demonic spirits. There are no bastard spirits. There's no continuation after the flood. It was all killed in the flood. Why? Because this is an introduction to rules, and you're responsible. You're not blaming demons now, right? This is up to you to not follow those sinning eyes of yours, right? Don't think that you're safe. So that it shows actually just how pervasive this story is, that even if you don't want to use it to explain sin, you have to at least give some lip service, right? Okay, we know this happened, but we're telling you it's over now. Like, this is teaching you about sin, but it's teaching is that sin's in you, that you have to fight sin in you, right? That it's part of the human condition, or the angelic condition, as it were, right? And you can't listen to your own will. You have to listen to God's commandments. So we're at the end of the hour. I do see another question, so give me a second. Do we know if the Qumran community foresaw its own demise because of not marrying, or that they thought they would continue through new adherents joining? I will say this again. Nowhere at Qumran is there a rule not to marry. Nowhere at Qumran is there a rule not to marry. Okay? And on the contrary, the Damascus Document mentions wives. The rule, the Serach HaEdah, the rule of the congregation, that's what it's called in English, the rule of the congregation, mentions wives. So absolutely, some of them were marrying and having kids because, did it go through certain periods where they weren't having kids? Was it a special group that didn't have, that wasn't marrying and having kids? We have nowhere, just the fact. So Serach HaYachad says the community rule says it doesn't mention women, but it doesn't say you can't marry. It just doesn't mention women. So is that a special rule book written for guys who went off on their own and they're just going to be men living holy and on their own, but they're not going to say you can't marry ever, right? It's not clear. The Essenes don't marry, right? So the Essenes are don't marry. It's the first thing anyone says about the Essenes. Anyone who mentions the Essenes, Josephus, Philo, the first thing they say about the Essenes is they don't marry, and they adopt. Yeah.
Is it possible that both Philo and Josephus were wrong and they didn't understand the Essenes and some Essenes
Yeah, for
were
sure.
men?
And the fact is, Josephus says some of them do marry and have kids, right? But at the same time, I believe also Pliny mentions them not marrying, because it's such a weird thing. It's such an unusual thing to do. I mean, the Shakers managed to exist for quite a long time, just taking in orphans. Taking in orphans, taking in converts, they continued for a while. So I don't know, like when we talk about these scenes, we're pretty much completely relying on Josephus. There's very little information outside of Josephus, right, to rely on.
The main argument for saying that the Dead Sea sect was not one and the same as the Essenes was the fact that it seems quite obvious that under some circumstances they did marry, whereas
no, that's not the only reason. The closest in terms of law, the closest parallel we have is with its Stokin, with the Zadokites. That's the closest. Like if you didn't have Josephus, you would absolutely say, and I admittedly, this was what my advisor's argument, right? My advisor said they are Zadokites. They are Zadokites who were actually religious and would not stand for Prushi law in the temple, and so they separated out. Now that's the closest thing to what they themselves describe, right? And of course, there is a problem that they do talk about the Stokim, and they call them, they do have problems, but they do talk about themselves in terms of Bnei Tzadok. So if we didn't have what Josephus says about the Essenes, no one would have connected them with Essenes, because we wouldn't have known about Essenes, and we wouldn't have had. Josephus has this great description of what it takes to get into the Essene community. That is very close to what it takes to get into the Qumran community, and that's pretty detailed. Okay, so that's the reason. That's the main reason why, and the fact that no women were found at Qumran, and that one of their rule books doesn't mention women. So those are good reasons, right, to connect them to the Essenes. But there are other good reasons to not say that they're just the Essenes. In other words, you can say there's a line, and I think also Eyal Regev would say this, that they are connected to the Essenes, but he would say they're not one-to-one Essenes, right? Or Essenes, however you want to pronounce it. And also the Essenes, one of the things that Josephus says about them is how much they believe in resurrection. And while the Qumran community clearly believed in resurrection, they do have several copies of Pseudo-Ezekiel that seems to be concentrating on that. They don't talk about it a lot. It's really not central to their texts at all. And you would expect them to be talking about it all the time. And they really don't. They really don't.
Which is a Zadokite thing.
It's an Essene thing, according to Josephus. Josephus goes into how Essenes are very courageous in battle because they believe they're going to get their souls back. Right?
Are the Essenes Zadokim?
No, not according to Josephus. Again, the big question is how much can we rely on Josephus, right? And that's a huge question, right? And another question is, when he was said there are 3 sects of Judaism, did he just want to find parallels to Greek thought? He needed a parallel for the Stoics, and he needed a like, that's the question, is that what he was trying to do? Or were there really, like, does it work the way he says it works, or did he just want to make it in a way that that Romans would get it? So that's the big question. He says they're the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, right? So we had nothing from these Essenes. We had nothing from the Essenes. They're not mentioned in the New Testament as opposed to the Sadducees and the Pharisees. They're not, and so all of a sudden you find the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they have a very close, a very similar description of how to get in that Josephus did, and it's unusual. It's an unusual. First year until until solids, another year until liquids. Like there's, and it's the same, and it's very, very similar, if not quite identical, but very close. And so you're saying, oh wow, here we have the Essenes. So there was reasons to say there's the Essenes, but I think now we have enough evidence and kind of thinking about it to realize that you can't just paste on the Essenes onto this community.
Isn't it fair to say on the basis of the Dead Sea Scrolls that the Dead Sea sect, for them, the Pharisees were beyond the pale and barely worthy of discussion, and their main bone of contention is against their fellow Zadokites?
Oh, they mentioned both. They mentioned Pharisees also. Nice try, though.
But
No, they hate the Pharisees.
Isn't their main rebellion against their fellow Zadokites?
No. I mean, that would work very nicely for Larry Schiffman's hypothesis, and they do say things against Zadokites. They do, but they have a lot against Prushim, right? They're the seekers of smooth things. They're not, and when they're talking about it, and again, when they're talking law, they're generally reacting to what we know of Pharisee law as opposed to Sadducee law, in other words, or Stoic law. So they have a problem that you can marry a woman can marry her uncle, right? They're like, right, I've mentioned this before. This is actually in the Damascus document. They're like, how can you say that? It's very clear and they have a way of talking, actually saying that when the verse is using male language, it means both. Right? It's not being gender specific there, right? And you should know that, right? And that's what they say. Like, no, wrong. You're not allowed to marry your uncle either. And also, you're not allowed to marry more than one wife, which is, that it's not clear what I don't know that's Stokim that or said that you can't marry more than one wife, but they also you can only have one wife. They have the whole rule of how impurity in water works. That follows what we know of Stoic law as opposed to Prushi law, as well as their rule about when you are purified through the red heifer. Right? Those are specific laws that match up to the very little we knew about Stoic law. So just that tremendous coincidence, it can't be just coincidence. So you could say, well, Essenes, when they kept laws, they kept Sadducee law, like Stoic law. You could absolutely say that. There's no reason not to say that. But at the same time, there are some big things. Again, the first thing people say about Essenes is they don't get married. And nowhere is that law. Nowhere is that law in Qumran. So you would really expect that law to be all over the law books. So I want to do a kind of a wrap up in terms of what we've seen in this class. So I want to kind of bring us back because we didn't have time to really dwell on it, but the Qumran community, you can see from this description of, and I'm gonna share my screen again because I want to go back to what this experience is in terms of it, particularly in 4Q 444, where he's talking about these spirits have become spirits of conflict in my frame, right? Whereas the laws of God are also in my flesh, right? And so God gave me a spirit of knowledge and understanding, truth and righteousness, to be strengthened by the laws of God, and to fight the spirits of evil. And this kind of, to me, and again, this was one example among several, kind of highlights what the experience was of being a member of this community that was so strict and so difficult, and yet I'm fighting all the time. There are these evil spirits inside me and I have to fight them. It's hard. It's not easy. And they're saying, but God has given me a spirit of understanding. God has lifted me so that I can prevail, right? And this kind of shows you this experience. If you ask, why is this the period where they're trying to say, where is sin coming from? I think it's because this is the period where they really feel this kind of existential conflict of, I should be righteous, and yet there's this sinning, right? And it's not clear what sin are they being pulled towards, right? It's not explicit like it is in the Talmud, where they'll talk about, like, for example, that you're being pulled towards sexual sin. It's not explicit at all here. What sin is it that they're fighting? but they're fighting this all the time, and they need to ask God for help. That is what happens when they're praying. And in terms of, and again, they see themselves as righteous. I am a righteous person. God has given me a spirit of understanding, so that I can fight this with the laws of God. And the idea is the laws of God are inside me. There's also an idea in this period, I've mentioned it in other contexts, that the laws of God have an almost metaphysical property of fighting sin. And you see it very much in these prayers, because normally you say, oh, okay, learn the laws of God. You'll see it like in wisdom literature, learn the laws of God so you won't sin, right? That makes sense, of course. But here it's the laws of God are actually in me fighting with sin. There's this idea that the laws of God themselves can fight sin in some kind of metaphysical way. And this, by the way, carries through. You see it also in 4th Ezra, after the destruction of the Second Temple, the book that's written after the destruction of the Second Temple, when the protagonist Ezra says to the angel, he says, even though we got the laws of God, that wasn't enough. We still have an evil heart, and it wasn't enough to fight sin. And he's arguing with that idea that just the laws of God are enough to be able to overcome. So thank you very much for joining me, and I will see you next week. We will continue with the rabbinic and later reflections of the Watchers, and where that comes out in our in actual traditional Jewish texts. So I'll see you next week. Susan, I see you have a question. How do they explain that the evil spirit of the bastards invaded their body? They don't. That's their job. The spirits of the bastards, that's their job. Their job is to go and cause sin. They, by the way, and it's important to note this, what they don't have an idea of in this period, and it's always interesting because in the Gospels they absolutely do, but there's no real demonic possession. Right? You don't have a sense, there's never a description that a demon is taking me over, and so I have no control over my body to not sin, right? Demons don't work that way in these texts, whereas in the Gospels they do, right? The demon goes into pigs and makes them commit suicide, right? But not in these texts. The only possible exception is there's a line in the Damascus Document where there are certain if someone did certain sins and they were considered to be under the influence of Belial, they are not actually killed, they get a lesser punishment, and those are specific. It seems to be talking about clerical issues, but when we go back to the Damascus Document, we'll look at that again. And it's still not, it's hinting that maybe you didn't have full control, that Belial was controlling you. But in general, demons don't take control. You can always fight against demons. And in fact, it's never a complete out, right? It's never like, oh, what could I do? The demon made me do it. You have to fight it, right? That's your job. But it does explain why you would want to sin in the first place.
Miriam?
Yes.
That's just a couple of quick technical questions.
Okay.
Did I understand right from what you're saying that there's a consensus in the academic world that the Qumran sect were not Essenes?
No. I wish, right? I wish. It's not a consensus. And you will absolutely hear some people, Armin Langa, for example, will get up and just call them Essenes. Right?
Yeah, I mean, my impression was always that most of them thought they are Essenes, and it's just sort of like they throw a bone to those who say it isn't by calling them the Qumran sect.
Okay, so most people don't. So a lot of Europeans will call them Essenes. They don't throw anyone bones. In Israelis are aware enough of other literature that they won't just call them Essenes, because they're not going to go and say, so for example, I haven't been to a conference in a little while. I know that certainly up until fairly recently, Europeans, you would absolutely see them just call them Essenes, right?
Mhm.
And a lot of it has to do with kind of the school of thought they're coming from. The same way that people coming out of the Italian school will talk about Enochic Judaism, right? So people coming out of European study, a lot of them will just call them Essenes. People in, I would say that probably in America, Larry Schiffman has enough of an influence that you'll see a lot of people call the Qumran community, because if you're a student of Larry Schiffman, you're not going to call them Essenes. In Israel, there's been enough done, like for example, by Eyal Regev, etc., that you wouldn't just call them Essenes. It's considered a little simplistic, but certainly Hanan Eshel considered them Essenes. I mean, I don't think that there's no real consensus, right?
Wasn't Hanan Eshel who thought that Qumran was just a pottery factory?
No. He gave a whole talk about how it's different from all these other arguments of what Qumran was. No. You're thinking of someone else. I don't know who you're thinking of, but it wasn't Hanan Eshel.
There is somebody who just thought it was one big pottery factory.
Well, good, great. Hanan Eshel gave a whole talk saying it's not a Roman fortress, it's not a fortress, it's not a farm. It's like, and he every time like archaeology would show this is what a fortress looks like archaeologically, this is what a farm looks like archaeologically, this is what and this is how it's different. No, he and in fact it's very easy. He has a nice little kind of guidebook to Qumran. You can see exactly what he thought of Qumran.
In terms of terminology, there is broad consensus that the Dead Sea sect equals the Qumran sect equals the Yachad.
Yes, except when you go into it, if you're like a Dead Sea scholar, you generally won't use Yachad that broadly, because frequently Yachad is specifically what's described in the community rule. So, and a lot of people think the community rule is describing either one group in the sect or one generation, one time period of the sect. So you can't, if you're writing a book, for example, like an academic book, you can't say, if you say Yachad and you're talking about the Damascus document, you're going to get called out on it. Okay.
Miriam?
Yeah.
One other thing.
Yeah.
Is there a difference between the term Sadducee and Zadokite, or is that the same thing?
It's the reason that, so that's what you see that I try to be careful, because Sadducee has certain meanings in like the Gospels, and I think there's a desire to say, okay, this is what we know about Stokim. We don't know that Sadducee equals Stokim the way that we think of Stokim, right? So I think that's the reason to say it's Stoki instead of Sadducee. So for example, when I talk about it Stoki, I'm talking about what the Talmud says about Stokim, right? That we have halacha from Stokim. Are those exactly the same things as the Sadducees of the Gospels? There's absolutely, it would be ridiculous to say they're completely different groups, right? But are the Sadducees who are arguing with Jesus in the Gospel, are they the same ones who are worried about when someone is purified from a red heifer? That's why people are kind of careful with it.
So what does that mean? That maybe they are a different group, or that it's a fictional group, or that what?
It's a good question. I don't have a super good answer. I think it's mainly that the Sadducees, as described in the New Testament, are considered to not necessarily reflect the Stokim in the Second Temple period. Not that it's not the same group, but it's a certain reflection of them.
Sorry, right? could you repeat that last statement?
Don't quote me on this, please. I think the idea is,
I want to hear your idea, though.
Yeah, the Sadducees in the New Testament are a reflection of an idea that's not necessarily one-on-one with the Stokim as they were in the Second Temple period.
Is it because of the Sadducees of the New Testament that some scholars seem to prefer using the term Kohanim B'nai Tzadok instead of Tzdukim?
The Kohanim B'nai Tzadok is making it even more specific. So when I say stokim, I'm thinking of the Talmudic, not Talmudic stokim, but who's described, right, in rabbinic literature, right? I'm thinking of the stokim as described in rabbinic literature. If you're saying Kohanim b'nei tzadok, you're saying something else. You're connecting it to this tradition that you see, for example, in Yechezkel, that the correct priests are the ones who descended from tzadok, right? And that there's a line, and that there's a group, and that is the basis of the Qumran sect, right? So you're being much more specific, and you're almost not connecting it with anything else.
Miriam, just to
You can
add
say
to
that, you're just not connecting it to stuff, right? Yeah.
just to add to it, like when most of what we know, what we hear about the Tzdokim, Prushim, and Isim are from, Josephus, who wrote towards the end of the 1st century AD. And much of these, writings and archaeology is from the 1st century BC, even 2nd century BC. And it could have been that either the sects were different or they had changes. So we have to be
very, very important. It's not just the New Testament, it's Josephus. So with Josephus, with the Essenes, all we have is Josephus pretty much, right? Besides Philo and Pliny. But it's mainly Josephus. But with this Stokim, we have a lot of information that's not Josephus, right? Or not a lot. We have some information that's not Josephus. So if I want to say, okay, this is something from the Stokim, I am saying, again, this is something we know that in rabbinic literature was connected to the Stokim, right? Usually I'm talking about legal aspects, right? If you talk about Josephus's Sadducees who don't believe in any sort of life after death, that actually kind of matches up with the gospel Sadducees, who are like, haha, Josephus, haha, Jesus, you say that there's going to be life after death. What happens with a woman who's widowed and remarries, right? So what's going to happen there? Ha, 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 right? And that's a Sadducee. A Sadducee says that because they don't believe in any sort of afterlife, right? And that's something that Josephus also is like pointing out in terms of what people believe in.
I know that there are different theories about this, but is the general consensus that the Sadducees, or whatever you want to call them, basically fizzle out after Khurban Bayit Sheni?
Yeah, I mean they all fizzle out after this.
All the sects, yeah.
Yeah, all the sects fizzle out. We have that's
the
one of the big questions. What
the,
happens to them? Did they go underground? So that's one of the things about why do we have medieval copies of the Damascus Document? Is it because these groups went underground and kept copying the documents, or is it because someone found them in a cave and gave them? There is in fact a story about Jewish scrolls being found in a cave and being given to the Jewish community. And so is it possible that they were actually found and copied in the medieval period, right? Or did these things go underground and were passed down, right? So in general, one of the explanations is the more centered you were on the temple with no other way of worshiping, or where everything was around the temple, the harder it was going to be to have kind of a religion after the temple was destroyed. I would also say the way the Prushim developed to have things around the study hall created an alternative, while also a community like the Qumran community was small. And I would imagine that small communities where in a period where everyone was devastated by and killed and go into exile, I would imagine small communities found it very, very difficult to keep their unusual religious practices or unusual religious beliefs. They had to kind of join the larger community because just to survive as Jews. So I think that would probably be the reason. It's harder to, and again, it seems that the Prushim were kind of in control of the temple when things went down for the most part. And so they would have the best chance of kind of leading the survival. But again, it helped to have this alternative, this kind of study alternative, and also fairly inclusive attitude compared to the other groups. right? If we say, you know, they're like, hey, anyone, you know, let's let people into the temple precinct. Let's make it so, you know, if you talk about halakhically, well, you can eat these things coming from Amar, like certain things that they said, hey, we're not going to be so strict because there are people who don't know the rules here and we have to let them participate, right? And you have those laws in the Mishnah and the Talmud. And those are that's kind of the Prushi way, not all across the board, but absolutely this idea that we have to let people worship. And so there are certain times and certain areas where we can be a little bit more lax. And again, what I always quote in terms of them versus Qumran, right? Where Qumran's like, how do you let blind and deaf people into the temple precinct when you know they can't possibly know purity laws? They're blind, they can't read, they're deaf, they can't learn, they can't hear. There's no way these guys are properly purified. How can you possibly let them into the temple? The Qumran people say, because for Qumran people, the important thing is that everyone be pure, not to cause impurity. Whereas for the Hushim, there is a value that everyone should be able to participate, to worship, to whatever. Not that they're never looking down on people, but the idea is you have to kind of allow for different classes of people and allow for those people to be part of things. Now, once you're exiled, you can understand why that would be the religion that would kind of carry the day in terms of the survival of this small exiled people who are now scattered all over the place. The fact is they were already scattered, let's face it. But we're now even more scattered and also had to deal with the loss of a temple where you couldn't understand, like, why is God so angry with us? That, by the way, is a big theme in 4th Ezra. Again, it's after the destruction, and it's very much like, okay, we sinned, but they sinned more, right? but the Romans sinned more than we did. Why are we the ones suffering for our sin, right? And that is, you know, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of struggle, and the Prushim were, for the most part, able to kind of carry the day. But, you know, again, it's a question of what happened. You know, what happened to these communities. With Qumran, they were small. With the Sadducees and Zadokites, again, probably a lot had to do with the temple, and also I think that they just weren't the ones who were leading. They weren't leading when it all went down. So they weren't the ones who could set the rules of engagement. Anyway, so thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.